My name is Elena, and there are memories I carry that still tighten my throat when I try to put them into words, because they live somewhere between confession and warning, between what I was and what I barely escaped becoming. The first time I realized something was wrong, it wasn't during a ritual or a night soaked in candles and symbols, but during prayer, quiet, ordinary prayer, the kind people assume is safe. I had knelt by my bed, exhausted in a way sleep never fixes, my body heavy, my thoughts dragging behind me like loose fabric. I remember thinking how strange it was that prayer felt harder than anything I'd ever done in the dark. My lips moved, the words came slowly, and then my jaw stretched open in a deep, involuntary yawn. It felt harmless, even human, until the air changed. There was a split second where my breath didn't feel like it belonged to me anymore, where something cold and alert brushed past my awareness, and my spirit reacted before my mind could explain it. People laugh when they hear stories like this. I used to laugh too, back when I was trained to see the body not as sacred, but as a doorway. Back when yawning wasn't a sign of tiredness, but vulnerability. In the circles I once ran with, we studied moments like that, pauses in attention, lapses in intention, micro-surrenders of the will. We didn't call them possessions or hauntings, we called them opportunities. That's what makes this so hard to talk about now. I know how easily these things are dismissed, how quickly someone will say it's imagination, superstition, psychology. I told myself the same lies when I was younger, when the idea of control mattered more to me than truth. But the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. As I knelt there, mouth still open, prayer broken in half, something inside me recoiled, not in fear, but recognition. It was the same internal alarm I used to feel during rituals, when someone broke protocol, when energy moved without being directed. My heart raced, not with panic, but with the certainty that I had done something wrong without meaning to. I closed my mouth, covered it with my hand, and swallowed hard, as if that alone could undo what had just happened. The room was silent, but not empty. That's the part no one warns you about, the silence that feels crowded. I forced myself to start praying again, slower this time, every word deliberate, my awareness pulled tight like a locked door. Whatever had brushed against me didn't linger, but the knowledge did. It settled into me with a weight I couldn't shake, because it connected too perfectly with things I had once been taught never to share outside certain walls. I realized then that leaving darkness doesn't mean it forgets you. It means you become responsible for noticing the ways it still tries to speak, still tries to slip in through moments people think don't matter. And that realization was only the beginning of what I would have to face next. I didn't wake up one day wanting darkness. It crept in through disappointment, through unanswered prayers and a bitterness I didn't yet know how to name. I was raised knowing about God, but not knowing how to feel Him. And over time, that gap turned into resentment. I watched people speak about faith like it was warmth, like it was safety, and all I felt was distance. When pain came, and it always does, I didn't feel held, I felt ignored. So when someone told me there were other paths, paths where silence was power instead of absence, I listened. Satanism didn't arrive dressed in red or fire. It came wrapped in intellect, rebellion, and the promise of control. They spoke about self-deification, about reclaiming authority over your own spirit, about rejecting the idea of submission. That appealed to the part of me that was tired of waiting, tired of kneeling, tired of feeling small. I told myself I wasn't choosing evil, just independence. I started reading, then attending gatherings, then participating. At first it felt ceremonial, almost theatrical, but repetition has a way of dulling your instincts. The language changed me. The symbols stopped feeling foreign, and slowly I began to see the world the way they taught me to see it, not as good and evil, but as awake and asleep. We were told most people walk through life unguarded, unaware of how open they really are. The human body, they said, is not neutral. It's a threshold. Breath, voice, focus. These were treated as tools, not accidents. I learned to observe people differently, to notice when they drifted, when their attention slipped, when their mouths fell open mid-laugh or mid-sigh. Those moments were always noted, always catalogued. Nothing was random. And the more I absorbed these teachings, the more distant prayer became. When I did try to pray back then, it felt weak, fragmented, like speaking into a room that refused to answer. I interpreted that as proof that I was evolving past it. But in truth, I was numbing myself. Rituals replaced reflection. Intention replaced humility. I felt powerful, but only because I had stopped listening to the quiet warnings inside me. There were rules in those spaces, unspoken but enforced. Focus was everything. Distraction was dangerous. A wandering mind could invite things you weren't prepared to manage. We were trained to keep our bodies tight, alert, sealed. Yawning during certain practices was corrected immediately, sometimes harshly, because it signaled loss of control. At the time, I didn't question why. I trusted the structure because it made me feel protected, included, significant. I didn't realize that what I called strength was actually constant tension, a vigilance born from knowing too much about how easily doors can open. By the time doubt began to creep in, I was already far from the girl who once believed prayer was simple, and that distance would follow me long after I thought I had walked away. In those years, I learned to see the body as something far more than flesh and bone, as more than a vessel to carry the mind through days and nights. The teachers I followed spoke of it almost reverently, not as sacred in the religious sense, but as a map, a network of doors and locks, of hidden vulnerabilities and secret passages. Every gesture, every pause, every breath could be a threshold if you knew how to read it. They drilled into us the idea that humans are constantly leaking energy, constantly opening themselves to forces they do not understand. And some of the easiest points of entry, they said, are the ones we ignore: the eyes, the ears, the mouth. The mouth, in particular, fascinated me because it was so ordinary. We yawn, we breathe, we speak, and yet every opening, every exhalation, every sigh carried risk if we weren't vigilant. Yawning was framed as a surrender, not the polite kind, the tired human kind, but a spiritual lapse, a pause in the armor of consciousness. The first time I was corrected for it, I laughed nervously. I thought they were exaggerating, dramatizing a natural reflex. But then they explained when the mouth opens, when attention drops, when breath is drawn in unguarded, spirits, entities I had been trained to sense and occasionally summon, can enter. The idea terrified me, but more than fear, it sparked obsession. I began to watch my own body with a clinical precision, cataloging every yawn, every stretch, every moment of distraction. In group rituals, the teachers would circle the room, eyes like lasers, and anyone caught mid-yawn or mid-lapse was reminded firmly that focus is not optional. It was drilled into us. The body is a gate, and the spirit world is constantly testing whether it can pass through. At first, it felt symbolic, almost metaphorical, a way to teach discipline and mindfulness. I convinced myself it was all about posture and breath control, but over time, the experiences themselves proved otherwise. I would notice subtle shifts in the air, tingles that crawled along my spine, a sensation of being watched when my own awareness faltered. The mouth, they explained, is the most dangerous because it is the most human. We eat, we speak, we exhale. We do not think of it as a portal, but that is exactly what it is. I remember one night, during a private exercise in focus, I had a tiny yawn, and the temperature in the room shifted. My hair prickled, my breath caught, and I felt unmistakably an uninvited presence brush against me, testing, probing, weighing whether I had left the door open. I closed my mouth, but the lesson stayed etched in my mind. Nothing in the body is innocent. Every involuntary motion, every lapse in vigilance can be noticed, can be used. By the time I left that life, the awareness had settled deep into me. Even now, I cannot yawn without thinking about it, cannot stretch my attention too thin without imagining what might slip in. It was not just training, it was a revelation. The body does not belong solely to the self, and neither does consciousness. And for those of us who once sought knowledge in the shadows, that is a truth that never really leaves. Leaving wasn't a dramatic moment of revelation or heroism. It was quiet, like stepping out of a room you've lived in for years and suddenly realizing the walls had been closing in all along. Fear, subtle and insistent, was what pulled me first. Not fear of punishment, not fear of God, not even fear of hell, but fear of myself, of what I had become, of how easily I could manipulate, observe, and open doors that should never be opened. I began to notice it in small ways, a shadow behind my eyes, a tension in my chest I could not shake. Rituals that once brought exhilaration now left me hollow. The energy that used to feel like power now felt like a weight pressing against my spirit, something waiting for an invitation I wasn't willing to give anymore. I started retreating, quietly refusing gatherings, skipping exercises, retreating into my apartment and the solace of silence. At first, the old teachings mocked me in my mind, whispered that I would be weak without them, that leaving meant surrendering knowledge I could never recover. But the pull of something else, the simplicity of waking without dread, of praying without strategy, of living without constant vigilance, was stronger. Prayer itself became my refuge, awkward and unpracticed, stumbling over words I hadn't spoken in years. At first it felt foreign, almost laughable. My voice shook, my mind wandered, my attention fractured. I was a novice in a practice I had abandoned in youth, a beginner in something that was meant to be familiar. And yet there was comfort in the struggle, a raw honesty that I had never felt in any ritual, any circle, any chant. Slowly, I began to reclaim the parts of me I had ceded. My body, once a gate for unseen forces, became mine again, or so I thought. But even in my solitude, even in my tentative return to faith, the lessons of the darkness lingered, etched into muscle memory and instinct. I could feel it in the smallest ways, the shift of air in a room, the sudden brush of awareness in my chest, the way my mind could sense intrusion before my eyes could see it. It made prayer at times terrifying because I understood too well that lapses, like a yawn, a breath too deep, a mind wandering, were invitations. There were nights I could barely bring myself to kneel because exhaustion made me vulnerable, and I remembered the warnings I had once dismissed. But fear was no longer the master, it was a teacher. It showed me how fragile attention is, how precious stillness is, and how easy it is to let something slip through if you are not fully present. And so I learned to return slowly, to rebuild trust with my own body, to practice intention in ways I had never known. It was not an overnight transformation. Some nights I would stumble, yawn, feel that prickling awareness brush against me, and have to start over, whispering words with every ounce of my focus. I was haunted by memory, yes, but also by the realization that leaving darkness does not erase it. The knowledge remains, and with it, the responsibility to guard the moments that seem trivial, the moments when we let our attention slip, the moments when something small, like a yawn, can open a door you thought you had closed forever. The night it happened, I was alone in my apartment, the city quiet beyond the windows, the hum of streetlights a distant heartbeat. I had been kneeling for hours, praying in a way I hadn't prayed in years, words trembling on my lips, voice uneven, mind wandering and returning again. Exhaustion had settled into my bones, a weight that no amount of willpower could lift. And then it came, a yawn, sudden and deep, the kind that opens your throat and pulls air in like a silent invitation. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was natural, ordinary, human. But then I felt it. The air shifted, not a sound, not a shadow, not a flicker of light, but a presence brushing against my consciousness, testing the openness of my spirit, probing the gap that my yawn had created. It was subtle at first, a pressure in my chest, a cold awareness that was not my own. My heart thudded unevenly, not with panic, but with recognition, with memory of the teachings I had once buried. This was exactly what they had warned about, the caution I had laughed at, the vulnerability I had never truly understood until now. I could feel it, not in a physical sense, but in the way the room seemed to lean in, as if space itself had become attentive to me. My breath caught and instinct surged. I closed my mouth, pressing my palms over it, whispering the words of prayer as if the sound could act as a lock. And yet, even as I tried to ground myself, my mind racing to reclaim control, I could sense it retreating, not fully gone, not gone enough. I started praying again, deliberate this time, slow, every syllable weighed, every intention focused, but the memory of the brush remained, a reminder of fragility, of the thin line between the physical and the spiritual. That instant shattered any illusion I had about safety, about separation, about leaving darkness behind. It made every story I had ever heard, every teaching I had ever disregarded, pulse with urgency. I realized then that attention is armor, that the human body is never just a vessel, that even ordinary acts carry consequences we rarely consider. Yawning, blinking, stretching, letting the mind wander for a second too long. Any of these can be an invitation if you are unaware, and for a moment I had been unaware. The lesson burned into me not through fear of punishment, but through the raw, undeniable evidence of experience. The presence was not violent, it did not shout or demand, it simply tested, observed, passed, and left me aware of the threshold I had ignored. I sat there trembling, whispering prayers into the space my body had almost surrendered, aware that this small human act, a yawn, had opened a door I had spent years learning to close, a door I had not even remembered existed until that night. And in that trembling, I understood something I could not unlearn. The body remembers what the mind forgets, and the spirit never forgets the lapses we allow. Since that night, everything about how I approach prayer, how I inhabit my body, and how I hold my attention has changed. I no longer kneel half-heartedly, no longer let words spill from my lips without intention. Every breath is deliberate, every pause measured, every movement considered. The lessons I once dismissed as superstition are now etched into the way I live. I watch myself constantly, not with fear, but with vigilance born of experience. Even the simplest acts, a yawn, a stretch, a deep sigh, are no longer unconscious. I pause, I adjust, I remind myself that every opening of the mouth, every lapse of attention is a threshold that I cannot afford to leave unguarded. Prayer itself has become almost sacred in its vulnerability. I speak slowly, whisper slowly, sometimes even mouthing words before uttering them aloud, making sure my spirit is aligned with my intention, that my focus is anchored, that nothing slips past unnoticed. I have learned to respect the silence in a room, to feel the weight of empty space, to sense the subtle shifts that indicate something else is near, testing, probing, waiting. I guard my body as I guard my mind, knowing that even small lapses carry significance. When I feel exhaustion creeping in, I stop. I do not fight it with pride or stubbornness. I honor it with discipline. I close my mouth, take a moment, and return to focus, understanding that surrender without intention is never safe. Even mundane routines, washing dishes, walking down the street, sitting in a cafe, are now exercises in presence. I pay attention to how I breathe, to the way my voice flows, to the moments my mind drifts, because I know the world is more permeable than most people imagine. These practices are not rituals of fear. They are practices of care, of respect, of reclaiming control over what once controlled me. And yet, the old habits linger in subtle ways. The instinct to watch, to catalog, to measure openings is always there, like a shadow of what I once embraced willingly. I have to remind myself that awareness is not obsession, that vigilance is not paranoia. It is survival, it is protection, it is stewardship of the self. And in that stewardship, I have found a new kind of freedom, a freedom that comes not from power over others, but from mastery over myself, over attention, over the thresholds that define what enters my life and spirit. I no longer fear the unseen, but I do not underestimate it. I respect it because I know from experience that it respects precision, focus, and intention. When I kneel to pray, I kneel fully. When I breathe fully. When I yawn or pause, I do so with awareness, returning immediately to the conscious act of guarding my presence. In this way, prayer is no longer just words. It is a dialogue, a negotiation, a careful opening and closing of doors I once left unprotected. The lessons I carry are simple in principle, but complex in execution. Never take the body for granted. Never let attention slip without awareness. Never underestimate the small moments that carry the power to shape the unseen. I have learned to live in these small moments, to honor them, to protect them, because they are where life and spirit meets reality in ways the mind cannot fully grasp. There comes a point when what you have seen, what you have felt, and what you have survived demands acknowledgement, not just from others, but from the deepest corners of your own soul. I have walked through darkness that you cannot imagine, a world where the ordinary becomes a doorway, where the most human of gestures, the breath you take, the yawn that escapes your lips, the pause of thought, can become a conduit for forces beyond your comprehension. I have felt presence in the absence of sound, weight in the absence of touch, awareness brushing against me in moments that should have been mundane, ordinary, safe. And it is precisely in those moments, the moments most people dismiss as inconsequential, that the most profound truths reveal themselves. You may think this is a story of superstition, a warning wrapped in hyperbole, but it is not. It is the raw imprint of reality as I have lived it, as I have survived it. It is the echo of lessons learned too late and the cautionary mark of knowledge that cannot be unlearned. Every time I close my eyes in prayer now, every time I hold my breath, every time I stretch, every time I yawn, I carry with me the certainty that vigilance is not optional, that attention is armor, that the threshold between what is ours and what is not is thinner than we ever allow ourselves to imagine. I want you to feel this, not as fear, not as manipulation, but as the undeniable weight of what is possible. Imagine for a moment the vulnerability of being fully human, the softness of your body, the unpredictability of your mind, the openness of your spirit. And then imagine that in one unguarded moment, the ordinary can become extraordinary in ways you cannot anticipate. I want you to ask yourself, in the stillness of your own awareness, in the spaces where no one else watches, what you might be leaving open without knowing it. What doors are you unconsciously unlocking? What invitations are you extending with a yawn, with a pause, with a moment of distraction that seems harmless, but in reality carries the power to change everything around you? Think about it. How many times have you taken your body and mind for granted? How often have you allowed your focus to drift, thinking nothing could touch you there in that place of ease and assumed safety? I have been there. I have lived in that ease. And I know with every fiber of my being how deceptive it is, how fragile it is, how easily it can be exploited if you do not cultivate awareness that pierces beyond the surface. The spirit world, the energies that hover beyond what the eye can see and the ear can hear, they do not negotiate. They do not plead, they observe, they wait, they test, and they act in silence. And sometimes the smallest of actions, the yawn, the sigh, the moment your attention falters, becomes their window into your world. I have closed those windows countless times, retrained my body and mind to respond with precision, with intention, with unwavering presence. And yet, I cannot pretend that the lessons end here, that the vigilance can ever be complete. It is a lifelong awareness, a discipline, a contract with yourself that says, I will not be careless, not even for a single breath. So I leave this with you now, not as a conclusion, not as an explanation, not as a finished story, but as a provocation, a spark, a question that lingers in the shadows of your own consciousness. If something as simple, as natural, as human as a yawn can open a door you cannot see, if a moment of distraction can invite forces you are unprepared to face, then what are you doing right now, in this instant, with the thresholds of your own body, mind, and spirit? Where are your windows left open? What are you inviting in without even realizing it? And if the answer is not immediately clear, if it sends a shiver down your spine or a sudden tightening to your chest, then perhaps you are already beginning to understand, in the deepest, most unavoidable way, the truth I have lived and the vigilance I now carry. The question remains, echoing in the silence, demanding a reckoning. When was the last time you truly watched yourself, truly guarded your thresholds, truly understood the power hidden in the simplest of acts?